Welcome to the 18th CRC Roundtable. This is our monthly virtual seminar series. If you haven't been with us before, our intention is always to host these targeted, very inclusive and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. They're designed for contribution, not consumption. And so for each seminar, we invite a diverse range of speakers, researchers, managers, other professionals to have conversations around the critical topics of the time. We want to build connectivity between all of us and increase our collective competency for decision making. So as a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, and we allow 30 minutes of discussion. That's actually, I will facilitate through the chat. If you haven't already done so, please in the chat, if you want to enter your name and where you're from, that's helpful to see where all the attendees are coming from. This is really all about us, which is giving us the space to ask the clumsy questions and to practice the bravery and humility necessary for building the future that we want. So at each of these webinars, we've begun by briefly talking about why this topic at this time by these speakers. It's a pretty easy answer this time around. While we have made significant progress in the reduction of loads to the bay, the most difficult part remains. That's actually reducing non-point source loads from both agricultural and urban land covers. That simply can't be achieved without ultimately increasing the number of watershed residents that are taking on the ground action. There are 17 million of them, and so I'd ask you to imagine the possibilities. Actually, in 2017, the Chesapeake Bay program conducted the Stewardship Index Survey, which was a comprehensive survey of people's actions and attitudes in the watershed. Overall, they found that actions with significant impact on clean water are not widely adopted. So, for example, something as simple as installing a rain barrel, 80% of residents could do it, but only 14% have done so. And there's similar numbers for other actions. And the popularity and the pockets of them suggest that they may be considered social norms in some communities or among some demographic groups. And so we really ought to be taking that information into account when selecting our audiences and talking about our actions. But there's also great potential. So, for example, there's a great potential to increase the number of watershed residents civically engaged on behalf of the environment. So 31% of residents have personally become involved in an issue that is important to them. They've attended a hearing, written a letter to the editor, engaging in a similar type of activity. But of those 31%, only 14% of those reported doing so on behalf of an environmental cause. And so that just, I think, points out the untapped potential that exists. So why these speakers are so excited to have them talk to us. I'll just tell you, you can see there are official connections on the slide, but let me tell you about a little bit that gives you an indication of why they're so perfect for today's conversation. I love this. Amanda Guthrie on her website simply says everything is connected to everything else somehow, some way. And she's really interested in the connections between ecological things and people's connections, or how people's relationship affect their decisions. And she's currently a PhD student nearing the finish line at VIMS, and looking at ways to improve coastal policy through these sort of social ecological assessments. Joanna Ogburn has a long history of bringing people together to solve shared conservation challenges. She's been running her own consultancy for about 6.5 years, providing a lot of expertise in conservation planning and facilitation, especially in multi-stakeholder collaborations. I think we have, we've already looked at the ground rules, and with that, with no further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. So you should be seeing my slides. If you're not, let me know. But thank you all for joining us at your lunch hour. And as Nee said, my name is Amanda Guthrie. So I am in my 5th year of my PhD at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And today I'm going to be talking about values, motivations, and decision making. So my work focuses on the coastal zone, and so I'm looking at coastal property owners, but also I want to touch on what this means for us as people who are engaging in this space and people who are aligning behaviors and trying to modify or adjust other people's behaviors. So for my work, I mostly focus on living shorelines. So in this context, I'm defining living shoreline as a spectrum. So it depends on the wave energy, and that influences what type of living shoreline is going to be suitable. So in low wave energy environments, we're going to have our planted marsh, which is basically a restored or created marsh. In our more moderate wave energy environments, we're going to have our marshes in conjunction with either an oyster sill or rock sill. And then lastly, in our higher wave energy environments, we're going to have our breakwater systems. And so these are going to be more based off of beach systems and in high wave energy. And so all of these, their main tenet here is that they use nature and use a natural feature to reduce erosion along the shoreline. And that's their key factor that makes them a suitable living shoreline. Although we do know living shorelines do provide habitat for fish and ecosystems, they also provide benefits to people, yet people are not installing them as much as they are, or as much as they could be. So it is fairly clear that ripraps and bulkhead are often negative for both people and ecosystems in the context that they sever the land-water interface. So they take away the natural adaptation capacity of the coastal zone, as well as reduce many of the ecosystem services that we rely on and benefit from, including water quality and habitat provision for species such as fish and crabs, while living shorelines, on the other hand, provide these. So we see in this graph here, living shorelines designated in green, they are increasing in implementation or in recent years, but they're not used as much as bulkheads and riprap. So why not? And so we're going to dive into why people are making the decisions that they are and how that relates across to private property owner decision making in general. So to do this, why are people making the decision to put in these non-ecologically supported structures, collectively called armoring? So many cases, bulkheads are seen as effective and durable, yet at the same time, living shorelines are often seen as more, or natural shorelines, which potentially include living shorelines, are often seen as more aesthetically pleasing. And so in this context, people are valuing the perception of the effectiveness of the perceived effectiveness of bulkheads rather than their aesthetic values of natural marshes. And also in this context, we know that the location and property type does influence their decision making as well. So those are more likely to armor when the properties are higher value, and they also are lower in the elevation frame, and they have higher erosion rates. So all of these factors are going to be individualized. And then also getting into this community norms aspect. Another key factor when we're trying to figure out why people are making the decision that they are is likely the community influence. So we do see that neighbors are often key predictors of a type of modification a person has, regardless of the environmental and physical setting that a person has. And so oftentimes armoring, since it's been around longer, is the more common use, and therefore people perpetuate armoring through social norms and through other actions. To get this into a more Virginia context, we conducted a mail survey and linked the decisions that people are making, their response on the mail survey with tax parcel information. So just very briefly, some of our main takeaways here is that if a property is surrounded by nature and agriculture, they're less likely to modify their shoreline property. And in this context, it's also less likely to be armoring. And so this potentially indicates the value of the people that are there for nature, as well as potentially the environmental context in which the property is lying in. Also, so to understand of who is making living shoreline modification decisions, we do find that people who report erosion and reported flooding on their survey were more likely to have a living shoreline. Also, they're more likely to use the home as their primary home rather than a secondary home as a rental property or as a vacation home. And so this also potentially relates to their perception and awareness of the changes that are happening to their shoreline as well. So with this, I wanted to highlight 5 or 4 factors that we asked if how they considered it, or if they considered it. So here we're going to have our living shoreline in green, our breakwater system in white, and this is separated out for this context, bulkheads in blue, and riprap in dark blue. And so across the board, people that installed these varying 4 modifications did want to have an effective modification. This makes sense as that's why they're installing their modification. But what's particularly interesting is that those that installed living shorelines more likely to report that they considered restoring the shorelines and the aesthetics of the shoreline. And so here we do see that there's personal interest and personal motivations coming into why they are installing the various modifications. And then lastly, if we look at if they said that they wanted to be similar to their neighbors or not, very often they did not actively consider that they wanted to be similar to neighbors. And so this indicates in many ways that there's social norms because this is an unexplicit determination to be like their neighbors. In a separate survey of also shoreline property owners, we wanted to survey or ask how people perceived various modification services. So with this, we asked their perception of the erosion effectiveness of bulkheads, of living shorelines, and riprap, again in the same color scheme as before. So what we see here is that those property owners felt that riprap was going to be more often extremely effective at preventing erosion and compared to bulkheads and living shorelines. And so this is not necessarily true. It depends on the environmental context as well as the wave energy that the house is situated in. So we also asked about the perception of the aesthetics of these various modifications. And similar to other work, we do see that people are rating living shorelines or more of the natural shorelines as extremely aesthetically appealing. And so with that, we do see that the decision making is probably going to be more related to the effectiveness perception rather than the values of the aesthetics. And so moving forward, recognizing how people value their own property and what they want out of their property is going to be a key factor in moving forward. So with this, we also wanted to understand what this means in the context of the law. So the beginning of law, there's a purpose statement, and this states the justification of the law, which basically implies the values that are underpinning the law. So colleagues down in Georgia went through and looked at coastal laws from Florida up to Delaware. And they categorize the laws based off ocean-facing or estuarine laws and determine that oftentimes these laws are seen in different contexts, where ocean-facing tends to have more beach and access recreation values, economic and tourism values, and habitat protection values. Whereas estuarine, so going to be more often your wetlands and marshes, it was inherently more to prevent degradation. Some mention of aesthetics, but generally just protection and prevention of degradation. But similarly in this context, oftentimes the desire to protect the property, desire to protect land from erosion often dominated and overruled the desire to prevent degradation of the wetlands. And so in this context, we do value the wetlands and wanted to protect them, yet we value erosion inherently, preventing erosion or reducing erosion over their inherent degradation. And so now bringing this back to us and people who are working in this space, I wanted to talk about and think about how our own values and interests align and reflect with this as we are working to align values and change behavior. What does that mean, and how does our engagement with the space affect how we interact with others and affect how we interact with this space? I wanted to bring up this quote that I read from the behavioral scientist. And the key part here is, what are we advocating for by studying this phenomenon in this way? And so in this context, when we're talking about behavioral change, in many ways, I do see that as advocacy. It may be not advocacy in the sense of legal advocacy or advocating or as lobbyists, but nonetheless, we are advocating for a view. And inherently by that view is affected by our view. And so it's also important to recognize when we promote this view, what else are we promoting with it? And if we don't critically think about what we're doing, as this quote says, we risk the perpetuation of make a difference scientists conducting studies that uphold hegemonic and often oppressive cultural narratives. And so recognizing why and how we engage, because we do know that we are affected by our motivations as well, it influences how we engage with others. And so with this, I think it's important to think about who we engage with and what fields we engage in this work, and what assumptions underlie the collaborations that we have and the fields that we have. So a common discourse or common challenge with this is the view of qualitative versus quantitative data, and what those data sets bring and how they differ in the depth that we can have and why we choose those different types of data. And then I also wanted to highlight a review by Bennett et al. In 2017, as he goes through the various social science fields that engage with natural resources and sort of what assumptions they underlie those fields and what they bring to natural resources. And then also additionally think about what institutional structures and norms affect our role and how that influences why we want to engage with certain projects. For example, grant structure and project goals are often to potentially get more grants and also get publications. And how does that influence how we set up the process and set up the grant to promote more work in the future? And additionally, particularly with grants, we're looking at payment for services. So oftentimes, who is considered a collaborator on projects, and in many cases, who is not considered a collaborator when we engage with communities. When we engage with communities, it's also important to recognize how communities might have survey fatigue. They don't necessarily see the results of our work. They don't necessarily get the direct benefits of our work. And so respecting that and respecting how we engage with them is critical to making sure that we do it in an ethical and reasonable way. And with this, I wanted to also bring in the idea and sort of how diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice is actually a scale. And how we think of these is how we engage with other people. So diversity, the way that I see it, is often who is at the table. And inclusion is who affects the decisions that we ask. Equity is who benefits from these decisions. And then justice is how do these decisions relate to current institutional and historical structures. And so recognizing where we fit on that scale is also important to recognize the level of impact that we expect to have or can have. And then lastly, I just wanted to bring up some questions that I found from this paper from Beck et al. Of providing structure for natural resource scientists and practitioners to reflect on these and have a more structured way of thinking about our engagement. And these 4 questions I'm pulling out from this longer paper of what are my motivations for this project? How do I personally benefit? How have I considered diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? What social considerations unavoidably impact the project, and how does my personal unique identity impact the aspects of this project? And with that, I wanted to conclude and sort of think about this, that I'm not necessarily saying one values or one way is necessarily better than others, but recognizing why we're doing what we're doing and how that influences how we act with other people. So I wanted to thank my collaborators for this project, Sarah Stafford, Donna Bokovic, and Shauna Jones. And then if anything, there's 2 papers that would be helpful to review for this, Ben et al. And Beck et al. And if you aren't able to access those, I'm happy to share those as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And as Joanna gets her slides loaded up, I just wanted to say I was not expecting to be shoved into an existential crisis during a webinar, but that's pretty much what's happening. So I'll be anxious to get to the discussion, and it looks like Joanna's ready.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you, Denise. And thanks, Amanda, for the great presentation. I was taking down some notes from your good thoughts there and suggestions. Again, I'm Joanna Ogburn. I run a small consultancy called JBO Conservation, focusing on building, facilitating, and advising multi-stakeholder collaborations. And one of the main ones I work with is Envision the Chop Tank. And I serve as the coordinator and facilitator for that partnership. And today I wanted to share with you a bit about Envision and how we work to bring people together to solve shared conservation challenges. So we are a collaborative partnership. We're not our own nonprofit, but we are a network of individuals and organizations that we've been building over the past, over 6 years now. It seems crazy to say that. But we started in late 2015 when there were a number of organizations and agencies that were interested in finding ways to more effectively work together to achieve some of their common goals, most relating to conserving and restoring the Choptank River watershed. And the whole thing really got kicked off with the help, I should say, of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who helped organize some of those initial conversations. And when they saw there was an interest in coming together under a collaborative framework, they provide the funding to really help us get off the ground in the first couple of years. So in Vision, we are modeled on the collective impact framework, which was first coined by two gentlemen with FSG Consulting in 2011. And it's a framework for moving from fragmented action to bringing a lot of different folks together to reach collective action and what they call deep and durable impact. And you'll see here on the quote on the slide here, it's based on the idea that large scale social change requires broad cross-sector coordination. And there are 5 core conditions or sort of 5 key elements to running a collective impact initiative. The first of those is having a common agenda. So one that lays out the shared vision, the primary goals for the initiative, and sort of a joint approach to solving the challenges you've identified. Having a shared measurement system, so ways to measure and evaluate your success. Having mutually reinforcing activities. So that's not necessarily meaning that everyone has to do the same thing, but that participants use their strengths and their skill sets to take on the pieces of that common agenda that they're kind of best suited for. Continuous communication, which is exactly as it sounds. So you have regular meetings and ways to communicate between meetings. And then also having what's called backbone support. So having dedicated staff that can really focus on building the infrastructure, doing the facilitation, and the overall coordination of your network. And since that initial paper came out in 2011, and there have been a lot of different initiatives that have experimented with this framework in a wide variety of fields, from education to poverty reduction to environmental work. There's been a number of suggested adjustments to the framework or sort of tweaks that are being made. For example, initially, this framework had a really strong emphasis on bringing together sort of CEO level leaders. And now there's a recognition for a need to put the community and community of stakeholders you're working with more at the center of the process. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons, the kind of tweaks that are being made to this framework. One, that there's never really a perfect framework that's going to fit all the needs of the community you're working with or the group. And so when I work with different folks, I typically pull from multiple theories, multiple frameworks, and use different techniques. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is to know your group, know the context in which you're working, the realities, and really listen to those you're working to engage, understand their needs, interests, and concerns, and let those really be your drivers. And then second, it's important to be adaptive. So pay attention to what's working and what's not working, and don't be afraid to try something new or different. I think it's the decentralized or self-organizing theory that really emphasizes experimentation. And that's something that it's been a really helpful principle for me as a facilitator to really keep in mind, and one that we use quite a bit in Envision as well. So now jumping into some of the specifics about Envision, it is multi-sector. As you can see here, we have state, federal agencies represented, local governments, environmental nonprofits, the agricultural community, even heritage preservation, farmers. This is just the steering committee that I have up here on the slide. And we do have a much wider range of partners and players that we engage throughout the partnership. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit here. Together, this group has developed a shared mission for the partnership, which is, as you can see here, to provide swimmable, fishable waters and enhance the health and productivity of native oysters in a way that best meets the needs of surrounding communities. So what that really means is we're working to improve water quality and habitat, and that's habitat both on land and in water. And we want to do that in a way that takes into account the needs and interests of those living and working in the watershed. So again, kind of really looking at both those environmental and where we can, socioeconomic issues that are impacting our communities, and ideally working at the intersection of both of these. We do work throughout the entire Choptank watershed, which overlaps 2 states, as you can see here, Maryland and a little piece of Delaware at the headwaters. There are 5 counties represented there as well. And early on, we recognized we really need to do a pretty in-depth stakeholder engagement process to understand the challenges that everyone was facing in improving and maintaining the health of the Choptank watershed, to identify some potential solutions to overcome those challenges, and then most importantly, to figure out what the right role is for Collaborative to take on. So you can see the steps we took here during this process. We interviewed 64 practitioners working across a variety of fields. We had a phone survey of folks that lived in the area that Opinion Works carried out for us. And then we did focus groups with community sectors outside of conservation restoration. So professionals working in tourism, working in economic development, recreation, and all those kinds of good things. Again, really trying to understand the overlap between environmental objectives and community interest and needs. We took all the great information and feedback we got from that process, and we developed it into our common agenda for the Choptank River watershed, which includes a series of goals, objectives, and strategies that we're all taking on collectively. It's really been our driver for the past several years. This came out in 2018. And this year, we're actually going to be doing an update to this agenda. So stay tuned for that. Since we published that common agenda, we've developed a number of work groups to carry out the various strategies there. At this point, through the steering committee, the backbone, and the work groups, we have over, I think, 40 different organizations, agencies, and community groups that are actively engaging in the partnership, which we're really excited about and always looking to grow that. Again, a wide variety of sectors represented, including interested citizens, community groups, community development corporations, ag interests, governments, all kinds of great people. And right now you can see we have 3 active work groups, one focused on working with local governments, one on engaging disenfranchised communities. And by that, I mean communities of color and low-income communities. And then one focused on breaking down the barriers to getting agricultural best management practices in the ground. And so now I want to share with you a couple of the initiatives that each of these groups are taking on. And a couple of things that I'll point out now that you'll probably notice as we walk through. There are a couple of principles that we found hold true across any of the audiences that we're working to engage. One, we found we really need to fill in gaps in capacity and provide boots on the ground. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then 2, it's terrifically important to listen and learn from those you're trying to engage, and those that have worked in these areas in the past, and really adjust what you're doing to kind of meet what you're learning there. So to kick it off, one of the programs we've been developing is to work with agricultural landowners to implement 3 types of best management practices or restoration practices, and specifically 3 that research has showed us are some of the most effective at improving water quality. And I guess I don't know if I should say unfortunately, but they're also some of the most hard to get in the ground practices. So these are things like trees, grass buffers, wetland restoration, and drainage ditch management practices. And in building this program, we used a lot of the feedback that we got from the stakeholder engagement process. We also built an advisory group of folks from across the agricultural community to really guide us in figuring out what is it going to take to get these things in the ground. As Denise mentioned earlier, in the Choptank, across the Eastern Shore, and I think across a lot of the Chesapeake, we've really, we've engaged those early adopters. Those folks are going to come to you and say, I want to do something. Or when you ask them the first time, they're like, yep, let's do it. Let's go. Let's put it in. We've kind of met all of those. And so now is trying to reach this next level of landowners. And that means we're going to need to adjust our practices a little bit and find different ways to really work with their needs and interests. So the program we developed, we created very flexible and tailored incentive programs, tailored to the specific types of practice we're trying to get into the ground. We also hired a full-time dedicated landowner assistance coordinator. This is somebody who goes out and works directly with landowners to understand what they want to do on the property, helps connect them to the right program, the right resources, and helps walk them through all the way through that process. And if any of you have worked with the agricultural kind of realm or tried to work with the various cost share programs that are out there, it can be pretty confusing. There's a lot of information, a lot of different things you can do. It's hard to know how to make it work. So having someone, these boots on the ground that can provide that kind of assistance, we found to be absolutely critical, along with that sort of flexible incentive that we're able to provide folks. And that's something we found on the residential landowner side as well. Having someone that can walk you through the myriad of programs that are out there and opportunities and clarify things has been really key. We also, through this effort, developed prioritization tools to figure out where to put these practices to get the most bang for our buck. With local governments, we have a work group focused on engaging those great folks. We have 8 different local governments that are involved in that work group, including staff from multiple departments and some elected officials, really trying to look at how do we increase restoration across these jurisdictions. In particular, to meet the needs of their constituents, how do we address some of the significant stormwater flooding challenges that they're responding to? We had great discussions with the groups, with the local governments. We did surveys, we looked at previous research, and identified that the biggest thing we needed to help with was, again, provide capacity, provide someone who can work directly with each of these local governments to help assess potential projects, to help develop and manage grant proposals, and to really identify opportunities to pull together multiple jurisdictions into individual grant proposals or share services across these different local governments. And then lastly, I know I'm probably running low on time here. We have a group that's worked on engaging communities of color and low income communities. And we're engaging 3 of those right now and working together to develop restoration plans. A couple key pieces to this work. One, we have hired community liaisons, and I shouldn't say hired, we're providing funding for community liaisons to make connections with different communities, to be on the ground, spreading information throughout the communities and getting feedback back to those partners that are engaged. I put these are comprehensive restoration plans to mean we are certainly working on those aspects like best management practices, but we're also trying to address other things that these communities have identified. Things from septic problems to I'd like to look at street lighting to I need help with the park, all kinds of different aspects to really, again, address all the types of concerns that these communities are seeing. And then we're really focused on directly connecting each community to the resources and expertise available. So if they choose to, if they want to, they can directly go after those grant opportunities. We will also always be there to help, however, and whenever they would like any kind of assistance. So that's it for me. I wanted to thank our funders. CRC was terrifically helpful this past year in providing some gap funding for us. NOAA has been there as a key partner, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Chesapeake Bay Trust, a lot of great folks involved. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you guys very much.
Oh, thanks, Joanna. And it was perfect timing. And thanks to both you and Amanda for giving us enough time for discussion. We already have a question in the chat box, but I did want to start off with something I think that ties it to the last webinar we had. And this question comes from our wonderful tech person, Lauren Ury. And she had noticed that in our last webinar, Laura Fowler had said something that really resonated, which was progress happens at the speed of human relationships. And if that holds true in both of your experiences, and I think it does, is there anything, could each of you speak to something that you've found that helps make those connections and build trust so that you're able to make progress? And why don't you both unmute and whoever wants to go first, you might just tell us your reflections on that.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in, Amanda, if that works for you. Yes, that really resonates with me. I think folks that do this kind of work, a quote that goes around a lot is work at the speed of trust. It's hard to do. Amanda mentioned sometimes you have funders who want you to work faster and with more communities than you're able to really address really well. So there are challenges there. I think when you're working with a lot of different folks, they're all at different levels. Some have different levels of understanding of all of the acronyms, right, that we all have to use. Some don't. And so when you're engaging multiple sectors and different types of folks, we have to slow down and kind of make sure we're all on the same playing field. And that does cause different frustrations and people want to move faster than others, but it's terrifically important to have that strong base to make sure we're all on the same playing field, and to really focus on building those relationships and having time to get to know each other, I think is is key. It's hard to take that time because you always want to get so much done, but it's terrifically important.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And I think to add on that, I think it's also making sure that the benefits are seen both ways. And I think in Joanna's talk, she was saying that it's mutually beneficial. And so I think providing that reassurance early on and maintaining that throughout, and not just you're there for the 2-year grant cycle, 4-year grant cycle. And so having someone, in many cases, an established person in the community that can be that point of contact has been helpful. And so working with people who are fully engaged with that and not necessarily the ebbs of flows has been helpful in the past, but I recognize that's not always everyone's case, but still having someone who can be that more constant point person has been helpful.
Oh, thanks. Great answer and great tie to the last one. There's a question from Loretta Collins. And I think Joanna might have a direct answer, but Amanda, please hop in. Can you give examples of how flexibility and tailoring is incorporated in BMP implementation programming for ag landowners?
Yes, I can. So if you're familiar with some of the cost share programs that are out there for agricultural BMPs, I'll start with tree buffers, for example. The cost share programs that are available through the federal government and the state government, they want to see trees get implemented along waterways. And so that's where the money is to buffer those types of areas for trees. When we're out there working one-on-one with landowners, and I say we, I'm not always the one doing that, but our coordinators that are doing that, what they're finding is it's really hard to only have a program that focuses on that. Often you have a landowner that, while they might be willing to put trees in a certain portion to buffer a stream or a waterway, they may also want trees somewhere else on the property. Or just buffering a stream doesn't really get them enough of a financial incentive to do it because it's not a huge acreage they're going to be putting in, which means not a lot of financial incentive. So in order for them to put those practices in those specific areas where environmentalists and folks on our end really want to see them, we have to be willing to put them in other places and again, sort of meet them where they are there as best we can. And so that's where that flexibility and tailoring comes in. I don't want to talk too long about that. I do have others, and Loretta, I'd be more than happy to chat with you about those. I'll put my thing in the chat here.
Yeah, let me go to the next question, Amanda, unless you had something to add. But Heather Dansker asked, to the extent you've engaged disenfranchised communities in identifying indicators or metrics for success, can you tell us how that process was designed, carried out, and what did they come up with in addition to any a priori metrics? And Heather, if you're on, feel free to unmute if you want to maybe be a little bit more specific in that.
Sure. Hi. No, I guess I was just interested, given what you laid out, Joanna, about making stakeholders more central to the process, of course, and I think probably many of us have experienced that shift. And to what Amanda was saying earlier, with regard to the reflection in the process and who gets incentives involved, et cetera. I'm just curious. We're engaging specifically with the disenfranchised communities, where you were talking about meeting them and helping them with a variety of their needs, and trying to be there for them. Like, how far does that go, and how do, given limited resources all around, how do you find the sweet spot of making sure that the process works for them?
That's a great question. Amanda, if you want to jump in here, I don't want to step on your toes.
You can go first. I can speak,
Sure.
but you're welcome to go.
That's a great question. There's a lot I could touch on there. I think what you just brought up is often what we found in working with some of these different communities is, while they might be interested in doing some environmental work, that's not always their top priority. And so they also want to work on this, that, or the other. And there is a balance there, right? We only have so much capacity, and there's only so much we can promise that we're going to be able to do, even in the environmental realm. So I think number one, it's terrifically important to be very honest and very transparent from the very beginning. Don't overstate what you can do. Don't make promises you can't come through with. That's happened a lot in these communities, and it's good not to do that again. What we've really focused on in trying to do that is when we meet with a community, not always first, but at some point, we bring in local government staff that are really good at working with folks, and that can address these different kinds of components that maybe some of our nonprofits can't, or some of our departments, at state government aren't really best suited. But we have those folks there who can speak to septics, who can speak to those other things I mentioned. So they kind of take it and run with that aspect and that piece of it. So it's really about kind of finding all the right partners and making those connections for them. And then being honest about, here's what we can make sure gets happened. Here's where we can take you with this. We're happy to, help you as much as we can here, but just being clear there. I hope that gives you some information.
Sure. Yeah. Just one quick follow-up is, have you engaged them directly in any kind of development of indicators and metrics?
Development of indicators and metrics, the communities themselves, I would say no, at this point we haven't. And we've been engaging these groups for about a year and a half, some of them for about 2 years. And I would say, again, this is where that speed of trust, it takes a long time sometimes to get there, and to even just build a relationship to walk into a community to where people will show up. So I think that's actually the next step. I would love to have a conversation with some of these groups to ask folks, what made you come to the table? Why did you even come to our meeting? What's keeping you here? And what's important for you to see as benchmarks going forward. Like initial conversations we've had with them, we know it's terrifically important to see something happen, not just to come in and have a meeting and have great conversations, but they want to actually see some action. And so we know that that's kind of a key benchmark we need to meet in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Joanna. Amanda?
Yeah, yes. To echo that, my first thought was honesty, because I think coming up and sort of recognizing where you're at and what you can do, people recognize that we're all human and they don't expect us to do everything. And so just being upfront and sort of where you're at and what you can do, I think is absolutely critical. And I think something people also, in my experience, so I'm working currently with a community in Missouri, is they just really want to be heard in many cases. And they just want to have, unfortunately, some legitimacy by someone else coming in and recognizing that, being another spokesperson or being, because a lot of times these people have been dealing with these problems, particularly this community is dealing with flooding, and they've sort of hit a wall, and they want sort of someone coming in and sort of refreshing and being another mouthpiece or different mouthpiece, and potentially with a different expertise or background versus just being a local community member that wants to address flooding. And so I think it really varies. I haven't actually gone through the indicators or metrics specifically. And I think from my perspective right now is that the indicators metrics is just making progress. What we don't necessarily have to have, this solved by this date, but sort of just moving forward is really a lot of times what communities want to see, because right now, a lot of times these communities don't have anything. And so something is better than nothing, and that's not a great response, but it's in many cases how they've been dealt with in the past and how they're experiencing it now.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And I think Richard Allen had a comment that I think applied to both of you, and you both touched on, was that initially offering your expertise in a humble way of public service was pretty key. I think you also, in answering that question, in part answered another one, was about specific examples of insightful events, programs, or activities for community relationship building. So we might come back to that if we have time, but there's another question that I think is really, I'd love to have each of you unpack. And Amanda, being in the midst of a dissertation, this might be really appealing to you to go first. Could you expand more on what social theories you use and how you blend those concepts into your programs or initiatives?
Yeah, so this is less of a social theory, more of an integrative theory. So something that we are looking at is is how ecosystem services in many ways is a bridge between how we can benefit people and ecosystems. So in this context, for my work in ecosystem services, improving water quality or reducing erosion or providing aesthetic value or fisheries habitat, and sort of using those as finding something that can link people and ecosystems together is sort of the way to move forward, and recognizing how that can benefit both. And in many cases, trying to find win-wins in expecting and moving forward with that as the baseline, and recognizing that what a win for someone else is not necessarily the win for everyone. And so adapting your win-win scenarios to everyone, of recognizing that a fish habitat is going to be really relevant towards a fisher or a fishing guide, but might not be as relevant for someone who just wants to have a dock and go out boating. And sort of so using this as a concept, but adapting it to the circumstances that you see at hand and who you're engaging with, but recognizing that there's a whole suite of benefits that you can draw from it and connects to.
Thanks, Amanda. Joanna? Oh, you're muted, Joanna.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, I think it's definitely more in Amanda's wheelhouse than my own, but I mentioned there are several theories that we typically pull from. Collective impact is one, self-generating networks is another. There are many out there. There's something called turning outward, comprehensive community building. There are a number of them out there, and I think the important thing that I always find is know them really well, know which aspects are going to work right for the specific community you're working with. And I think experimenting is sort of the top thing that I have learned over the years to get comfortable with. Try out different things for your group. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. Let the groups know that we're working on this together. We're going to try this out. There's no perfect way to do it. So, let's give it a go.
Yeah, and Joanne, I think that brings up a point. We were having a conversation before, and you had mentioned learning in your presentation. I mean, be willing to consistently learn. Like, there's not one thing that you're not looking for the silver bullet. You're just trying to make steps into what would work, and I think that's important. I have a question actually, and Lauren again brought it up. Both of you talk a lot about appealing to people's values, or the consideration of the values of the person you're speaking to. And Lauren had a great question, like how do you maintain authenticity when appealing to people's values, right? Because they may not be your own, but how do you keep that appearing authentic?
Do you want me to take a stab at it, Amanda?
Yeah.
Go for it.
You should first ask somebody that I've worked with to see if they feel I've been authentic. I think it's probably a good start. No, I'm just kidding. Hopefully it's working. I think number one, there's some key rules when you're doing any kind of collaboration or organizing. Meet them where they're comfortable, right? Go to their house, go to the park, or wherever, meet them there, sit down, have a conversation, take as much time as they want to take. Not more, but as much time as they want to take. Take the time to get to know them, ask them questions about themselves, find commonalities, really get to know somebody. And I think when it feels right and feels appropriate, it's okay to share your values. I wouldn't push them on anybody, but to say like, well, I'm coming from this, but it seems you're interested in that. So, let's work together on it. I think also just trying to, appreciate those conversations and what you can learn from it. And I think really internalizing that there's something you can learn from that person, and to listen for it, I think, and enjoy that process. I think hopefully that shows that you're there to be authentic, and stick with it. Amanda pointed that out. If they say no, don't just drop them, right? You might want to have a follow-up conversation. Maybe they're interested in something you're not doing, but somebody else is. Make that connection for them. So don't just be there when they're doing what you want them to do. Be there however you can help.
Great, thanks. Amanda?
To add on to that, I think it's recognizing that in many ways we all do come together for the same values. And it's just at a very base level, we all want a better future. And, you know, like as a very baseline, and recognizing what a better future is very different for people, but sort of, you know, recognizing that there are commonalities among us and among as people, and we don't necessarily need to connect on values that are relevant to that project. You can connect on values as, you know, existing in life and sort of the things that are going on. And so I totally understand of, you know, you don't want to be coming on and changing your messaging just to reflect with them, but truly understanding why they feel that way and why that matters to you, that you're connecting with them. I think that can be authentic when you're trying to help them for the benefits of their sake rather than for your sake. And in many cases, if you are only benefiting and working with them for your own benefit, that's not authentic as is. And so recognizing that you don't have to agree on everything, you can still agree on the direction and where to move and how to move, but not necessarily why you're moving that way.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I think we could go back actually to a question from Mandy Bailey and ask you, because it follows on the theme of what you both talked about, is persistence and learning and experimentation. But what was a specific example of an event, a program, or activity for community relationship building that worked, that you went, oh, I've hit on something, right? That you can offer to the audience to maybe, you know, an idea to try. So, Amanda, do you want to go first this time?
I'll jump in here. So I have two programs that came to mind with this, and so they're more of external programs that I've been tangentially affiliated with or directly affiliated with. So with this is a plug for the Thriving Earth Exchange. It's a partnership with AGU, so American Geophysical, remember what the U stands for, AGU.
Yeah.
And so they have a volunteer-based program where scientists become either facilitators or scientific experts for communities. And so they have communities that come to them asking for guidance and assistance. And so they have training for facilitators on how to best connect with communities, and then those facilitators then connect with other scientists. So oftentimes the facilitators are scientists, but they don't have the expertise, or they're not expected to have the expertise necessary. And so oftentimes they provide this. And so that's a really helpful program that has cohorts every year. And through that program that I've learned about another organization called Anthropocene Alliance, into A2. And so they are actively expanding, and they do this generally. So they mostly work on flood-prone communities and are expanding to fire hazard-based communities. And they connect to local community members and provide them with either scientific or legal or other various connections as well. And so those are the two direct programs that I've had the opportunity to work with.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, food, I would say, is a biggie, which is not always easy to fund. But I think, number one, understand the cultural norms, you know, the culture of the group you're trying to engage. And so that's where, if you have someone that's from that community that you can work with as a conduit, or you take the time to get to know some of those folks before you host an event or a community event, you can really figure some of that out. I was just on a call earlier this week with some folks from Louisiana doing some great work down in New Orleans. And they mentioned king cake around Mardi Gras, low country boil, right? If you're going to do something, you want the community there, that's what you have to have. So I think understanding where those folks are comfortable, that's really important too, where they'd like to be. Food is important, and what kind of cultural things make sense for that group. And the other thing that we've learned, especially engaging communities of color or low-income communities, is something active has actually worked quite a bit better than coming in and sort of trying to present or have a conversation when somebody doesn't know you. It's a bit uncomfortable. So when we've done things like cleanups or stream restorations or anything like that, we've had more community members come out, and they've brought their kids, they've brought relatives, they brought other people. And so that's an opportunity where you can more easily get to know someone and sort of share some of those key points casually in conversation. It's worked actually a lot better than your typical kind of meeting or workshop. So I'll say that's been really impactful, something we've learned.
Oh, great. We have just about 5 minutes left. I would say if anyone has a question, we might have time, but and just a reminder, if your question doesn't get asked, we follow up with the speakers. But I'd like to ask you in the couple minutes left, if you had one or two takeaways that you'd like to, that you're hoping people are going to leave this conversation with. It could be from your own material or something you learned from each other, right? But what might you offer people as things to keep in mind as they go back to their day activities today?
I'll jump in here. So I think something that I've been hearing and Joanna echo as well is just be who you are. In many cases, be humble and be human, and sort of. And I think, you know, as long as we're, oftentimes you can be perceived as, you know, disconnected, and oftentimes we might be, but recognizing that there are points of connection and sort of ways to engage and connect with people, and recognizing that we're all just people trying to have the best situation and move forward and work with that. And so, you know, in many ways, just being humble and respectful of different experiences and different ways of knowing and different lives. And that's all an interesting and beautiful thing to learn from and work from.
Amanda, I would also say that I'm going to reflect on those questions about asking myself, or being honest with myself too, right?
Right.
About why I'm doing what I'm doing. So that was helpful. Joanna?
Oh, you guys had great points. I would love to echo both of yours. I think that's great. And the same thing, Denise, I want to ask those same questions and just keep going over those things in my head too. I think, you know, I mentioned this to Denise and Amanda before the presentation. When I think about the word align, and it usually, I don't know, gave me an odd feeling the first time kind of I started hearing that word used a lot, aligning behavior, changing behavior. And I think it's just important to keep in mind that it's not just about asking other folks to align with our environmental objectives or somebody's environmental objectives. It's a give and take. We both kind of have to adjust and find sort of a new line of alignment that fits both of us. There's an adjustment on both sides, and that there's a lot to learn from the folks on the ground that you're trying to engage. And I've learned a ton, and I've been wrong. I've adjusted. I've done things, you know, differently because of it. And I've really enjoyed all the different folks I've met doing that. I think the other thing I mentioned before is don't be afraid to experiment and try some things out, and just be honest. If it doesn't work, that's okay. Then you adjust and find a new road to take. But yeah, have fun with it.
Oh, I want to thank you both. It was really fascinating. I have a lot to process now going back this afternoon. So thank you both. I'd like to remind people of two things. One is that our next webinar topic is going to be art and the role it plays in the restoration and what we're all trying to achieve. So that'll be March's webinar. Also, we have a new LinkedIn group that tries to follow up on the conversation of the webinar. So we'll send out the link to that, I believe, when we send out the link to the recording and the panelists, any additional notes the panelists want to make. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And thanks again to everyone who attended, the whole group in the conversation, but especially Joanna and Amanda. Thanks again.